The country that chose silence while the world was burning. While the world was tearing itself apart through war, ideology, and collapsing empires, one country made a decision so quiet that it barely registered at the time, choosing restraint over reaction and silence over declaration, believing distance from chaos would guarantee survival. That choice still matters today because moments of global crisis do not disappear when the noise fades. They leave behind consequences that quietly reshape power, relevance, and identity long after the fighting ends. At the start of the 20th century, the international order was breaking down as old empires weakened, alliances fractured under pressure, and new ideologies promised strength through dominance, forcing every nation, large or small, into a dangerous moment of decision. This country watched carefully as neighbors rushed into conflict, drained their economies, lost generations of people, and shattered internal stability, concluding that neutrality was not cowardice but discipline, and that silence could function as a shield in a violent world. For a time, the strategy appeared successful as trade continued. Cities remained untouched, and daily life moved forward while nearby regions collapsed, reinforcing the belief that staying quiet was not avoidance but wisdom earned through patience. Silence slowly became part of national identity, praised as maturity and leadership and emotional control in a world ruled by impulse, while leaders assured their people that survival did not require choosing sides. But history does not pause for restraint, and while this country stayed quiet, the future of the world was being negotiated elsewhere by those willing to speak, pressure, and decide. Borders shifted, power structures changed, and new rules replaced old ones without this nation's voice, not because it was excluded by force, but because it had chosen not to be present. At first, there was no clear warning, no invasion, no collapse, and no dramatic moment of regret. Only the slow realization that the world had stopped asking for this country's opinion. What began as protection was gradually becoming absence, and absence, in global history, is never neutral. Silence carried consequences that were easy to ignore at first, because nothing visibly broke and no immediate disaster followed, allowing leaders and citizens alike to believe that restraint had saved them from the pain everyone else endured. While armies clashed elsewhere, new power centers were forming quietly through negotiations, secret agreements, and post-war planning that would define influence for decades. And this country was not present in those rooms, because it had chosen distance over involvement. The world was no longer shaped only by battles, but by who helped write the rules after them, and silence offered no leverage when decisions required signatures, commitments, and clear positions. As international institutions began to emerge, designed to stabilize peace and control future conflicts, this country found itself invited late, listened to briefly, and rarely consulted when real power was exercised. Its neutrality, once seen as wisdom, began to resemble hesitation, and hesitation slowly translated into reduced trust among allies who questioned whether silence would continue when cooperation was required. Economic relationships also began to shift, as trade favored those with political alignment, strategic guarantees, and shared interests, leaving neutral players increasingly dependent rather than influential. At home, the costs were difficult to explain because nothing had gone obviously wrong, yet opportunities were disappearing, influence was shrinking, and decisions affecting the nation were being made elsewhere. Generations grew up believing silence was safety, unaware that safety without voice slowly becomes vulnerability in a world governed by collective power. This was not punishment imposed by enemies, but a consequence created by absence, as relevance faded not through defeat, but through non-participation. And slowly, the country began to realize that choosing not to choose had still been a choice, one that could not be undone. The real conflict emerged slowly, not through invasion or collapse, but through the quiet erosion of influence as the world reorganized itself around alliances, blocs, and shared strategic visions that demanded clarity instead of caution. As global tensions resurfaced in new forms, this country found itself trapped between powers that expected loyalty, contribution, and commitment, while its long tradition of silence offered no clear answer to increasingly urgent demands. Each international crisis forced the same uncomfortable question again and again: whether neutrality could still function in a world where economics, security, and technology were deeply interconnected and impossible to separate from politics. Allies grew wary, not because this nation was hostile, but because it was unpredictable in its restraint. leaving others unsure whether silence will hold during moments that required action rather than observation. Internally, debates intensified as younger generations questioned whether inherited neutrality still served their future, while older leaders defended it as moral high ground earned through restraint and historical survival. The tension was no longer external alone, but domestic, as the country struggled to reconcile pride in its past with anxiety about its shrinking role in a rapidly accelerating world. Every new global shock exposed the same weakness, because silence worked only when others were willing to absorb the cost of speaking, defending, and confronting instability on its behalf. As conflicts multiplied and power concentrated among coordinated groups, remaining outside no longer meant independence, but dependence on decisions made by those willing to act. The country faced a paradox it could no longer ignore: that neutrality had preserved peace at home, but had slowly limited its ability to shape the forces threatening that peace. This was the moment when silence stopped being a strategy and became a liability, as history demanded participation, not distance, from those who wish to remain relevant. The build-up reached its peak when leaders realized that the greatest risk was no longer choosing sides, but being permanently sidelined in a world that no longer waited. The climax arrived without explosions or headlines, but with a realization that was impossible to escape, because the world had finished reorganizing itself, and this country was no longer central to the outcome. The silence that once felt powerful now echoed back as limitation, as alliances solidified, influence hardened, and decisions moved faster than neutrality could adapt. In a world shaped by cooperation and confrontation, staying quiet no longer preserved control, it surrendered it, leaving the nation dependent on frameworks it did not help design and rules it did not help write. The strategy that once protected lives now constrained choices, as economic pressure, security reliance, and diplomatic marginalization closed in from every direction. There was no single moment to point to, no treaty to blame, and no enemy to condemn. Only the slow clarity that survival without participation carried its own cost. Silence had avoided war, but it had also avoided influence, leaving the country stable yet increasingly irrelevant in conversations that defined the future. The resolution is not that neutrality was wrong, but that it was incomplete, effective in one era and fragile in another, reminding us that history rewards adaptation more than consistency. What once saved a nation can later confine it, especially when the world changes faster than identity. This story matters today because the same choice appears again and again, not only for countries, but for institutions, leaders, and societies deciding whether to engage or withdraw when uncertainty rises. Silence may feel safe in the moment, but over time, it quietly shapes who gets to decide what comes next. Subscribe to join the journey. The